Welcome to the History Max podcast. Usually when we talk about a system collapsing, there's an expectation of precision. Like, if a bridge falls, structural inspectors will comb through the wreckage, locate a specific stress fracture in a steel beam, and just point to it.
Right, the failure is visible.
Exactly. Makes
Yeah.
sense. But when you apply that structural logic to an entire civilization, the methodology often falls apart. Today, we are looking at 12th century Japan. And on the surface, everything appears completely refined.
Yeah, the imperial court in Kyoto is entirely focused on poetry, calligraphy, and, aristocratic aesthetics.
It looks like a society operating at its absolute cultural peak.
It was the height of the Heian period, a culture obsessively dedicated to the pursuit of beauty and grace. To a casual observer, the structural integrity of the state would have seemed flawless.
But beneath that beautiful surface, the foundation was rapidly disintegrating. And identifying that underlying fracture is our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are pulling from a wide array of sources: early historical chronicles, modern archaeological analyses, and the great literary epic, The Tale of the Hike.
Right.
We are using these to unravel the Genpei War. This conflict, which raged from 1180 to 1185, was a defining national civil war. It completely upended Japan's political landscape.
It really did.
It eradicated the dominance of the Kyoto imperial court, annihilated an entire ruling family known as the Taira clan, and inaugurated centuries of samurai-led military government.
We are essentially dissecting a total system collapse followed by a highly calculated rebuild.
Yeah.
And to truly grasp the stakes of this conflict, we need to establish the linguistic and historical foundation of the war itself.
Let's do it.
The word Genpei is derived from the Sino-Japanese readings of the two warring clans. So Gen represents the Minamoto clan and Pei represents the Taira clan.
Okay, got it.
Depending on the specific historical texts you consult, you will also see this conflict referred to as the Jishu War, which is a name derived from the imperial eras that the war spanned.
But fundamentally, the geopolitical reality is Minamoto versus Taira.
Exactly. Minamoto versus Taira.
And the reality of this war defies a lot of modern expectations. I mean, we are talking about epic naval battles determined not by superior technology, but by the gravitational pull of the moon.
Yeah, the tides.
We're looking at heavily armed warrior monks systematically dismantling infrastructure and political betrayal so severe they reshape the legal code of an entire nation.
It is incredibly complex.
But to comprehend why these two massive clans go to war, we cannot just look at the spark. We have to look at how the pot boiled over.
Right.
The Taira clan did not just suddenly declare war.
No, not at all. They spent decades slowly hijacking the imperial court from within. They executed a remarkably methodical takeover.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how a provincial warrior clan could maneuver themselves into the highest echelons of imperial power, we have to examine a systemic economic flaw.
A flaw that had been metastasizing in Japan for centuries, yes. For a very long time, the Fujiwara clan had dominated the civilian government in Kyoto.
Right.
They maintained their grip on power through calculated marriage politics. They would marry their daughters to emperors, and when those emperors had sons, the Fujiwara grandfathers would act as regents.
So they were wielding the actual executive power.
Exactly. It is a classic power behind the throne dynamic.
But while the Fujiwara were endlessly distracted by these intricate court politics and marriage alliances, they ignored a massive leak in the country's economic engine.
The central court relied almost entirely on taxation from public lands.
Right.
However, a parallel system emerged where powerful nobles and massive Buddhist temples began establishing private estates. These were known as shin.
Shin. And crucially, these shin were granted tax-exempt status.
Yeah, that tax exemption is the crucial stress fracture you mentioned earlier.
It seems like a massive oversight.
It was insidious. A local farmer, burdened by heavy central taxation, would legally commend or donate his land to a powerful tax-exempt noble or temple.
Oh, I see.
In exchange, the farmer would pay a lower rent to his new patron. The central government, meanwhile, received absolutely nothing.
I want to focus on the scale of this problem, because it is the mechanical cause of everything that follows.
It really is.
If more and more land becomes tax-exempt through these Cheyenne arrangements, the central government is just starved of revenue. Think about how a modern municipality functions.
Right.
If every major corporation and wealthy landowner suddenly found a legal loophole to stop paying property taxes entirely, the city's budget would collapse overnight.
They wouldn't be able to pay for anything.
Exactly. The city would no longer be able to afford a professional police force, road maintenance, or a standing army.
And that is the exact logistical crisis the Han court faced. They lost their funding, which meant they could no longer project military authority.
But the private estates still needed protection.
Yeah, if you own a massive, wealthy shon, you have to secure your borders from bandits, rival estates, and local rebellions.
So what do they do?
Well, the estate owners turned to local provincial managers, men who were armed, trained, and capable of maintaining order.
The early samurai.
Yes, these were the early bushi, the warriors. The imperial court essentially privatized its military operations because it could no longer afford to fund them directly.
So the central government is outsourcing its national defense to these private security contractors.
That is exactly what it was.
But there's an inherent danger here that the Kyoto aristocracy seemed completely blind to. When you rely entirely on private contractors for your security, you are eventually going to realize that they hold all the leverage.
Right, they have the weapons.
They have the martial training and the local loyalty.
And the realization of that leverage is exactly what propelled the Taira and the Minamoto to prominence. By the mid-12th century, these two warrior coalitions were the dominant military forces in the country.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah. The aristocratic factions in Kyoto actually began actively bringing them into the capital to settle their own political disputes.
Oh, that sounds like a terrible idea.
It was. In 1156, we see the Hugen Rebellion, and shortly after, in 1159, the Heiji Rebellion.
And what were those about?
These conflicts were essentially factional disputes within the imperial family and the Fujiwara clan over succession and influence.
But the aristocrats didn't fight.
No, they used the Taira and Minamoto as their proxy fighters.
And when the dust settles from those early rebellions, the Taira, under the leadership of a deeply ambitious man named Taira no Kiyomori, come out victorious.
They do.
They do not just defeat the Minamoto, they completely crush them.
The aftermath was brutal. Kiyomori executed the central leadership of the Minamoto clan. He systematically purged their political influence from the capital.
He cleaned house.
She did, but he made a deeply consequential calculation.
What was that?
He spared a few of the very young Minamoto heirs, sending them into exile in the remote eastern provinces.
I stared at him.
He believed that without their fathers, isolated in hostile territory, they were effectively neutralized.
Well, we will see exactly how that calculation backfires later. But what strikes me about Kiyomori is his sheer audacity following these victories.
Right.
He does not take his army and return to his provincial strongholds. He stays in Kyoto, and by 1167, he achieves the title of Daiju Daijin, the chancellor.
The magnitude of that appointment cannot be overstated. He became the first samurai, the first provincial warrior to run the Grand Council of State.
That is wild.
Historically, this role was the absolute apex of the civil government. It was reserved exclusively for the highest-ranking, most refined aristocrats.
It is staggering.
Yeah.
I mean, he is a hardened military man who essentially kicks in the door of the most exclusive, bloodline-obsessed political club in the country and takes the chairman's seat.
And he immediately adopts the old Fujiwara playbook.
Of course he does.
He marries his daughter into the imperial line. Then, in 1180, he forces the sitting Emperor Takakura to abdicate and places his own grandson on the throne.
This new emperor, Antoko, is 2 years old. It's like a private security contractor, not just taking over the government, but installing their own toddler as the head of state.
Kiyomori was executing a total usurpation of the system, but his intention was never to destroy the imperial court or abolish the aristocracy.
He wanted to be the aristocracy.
Exactly. He wanted the Taira to become the new establishment. He envisioned his family replacing the Fujiwara as the permanent, unshakable power behind the throne.
But this requires us to look at the mechanics of patronage. If Kiyomori is seizing the highest offices and redirecting all the most lucrative land grants and government posts to his immediate family,
Which he was.
what happens to the thousands of other warriors? The system was deeply exclusionary.
And that exclusion created massive systemic resentment. Kiyomori's policies alienated a vast demographic of provincial warriors.
Because they weren't getting paid.
Right. Surviving Minamoto retainers were entirely shut out of the spoils. Even allied Taira branches felt marginalized if they were not part of Kiyomori's inner circle.
So you have a heavily armed, highly trained, and economically disenfranchised class just waiting for a legitimate excuse to dismantle the new regime.
That legitimate excuse finally arrives in May of 1180.
But the call to arms does not come from a disgruntled samurai in the provinces.
No, it does.
It comes from within the imperial house itself, from Prince Mochihito.
Prince Mochihito was a son of the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa.
Okay.
And because of Kiyomori's heavy-handed maneuvering to install his 2-year-old grandson on the throne, Mochihito was entirely bypassed in the line of succession.
He felt cheated out of his birthright.
Yes. More importantly, he viewed the Taira not as legitimate rulers, but as military usurpers illegally occupying the court.
So Mochihito aligns himself with a veteran warrior named Minamoto no Yorimasa.
Right.
Together, they do something incredibly dangerous, something that changes the legal framework of the brewing conflict. Mochihito issues a formal, official edict calling on the Minamoto clan and any loyal forces across the country to rise up and destroy the Taira.
That edict is so important. It provided the vital legal justification.
They made it official.
It transformed a potential rebellion from an act of treason into a righteous, imperially sanctioned crusade.
But it doesn't go smoothly.
No. The Taira operated a highly effective intelligence network in the capital. They intercepted the plot before Mochihito and Yorimasa could fully mobilize a credible army.
So the element of surprise is gone. Mochihito has to run for his life.
He flees south toward the city of Nara, seeking sanctuary at a massive temple complex called Midera.
And this introduces a profound dynamic into the conflict, because when the prince needs an army in a hurry, he does not find standard samurai.
No, he turns to the Suhei.
The warrior monks.
The warrior monks, yes.
I think we need to spend some time analyzing this, because the term warrior monk creates cognitive dissonance for a lot of people.
It really does.
The modern conception of a Buddhist monk involves asceticism, deep meditation, and strict pacifism. Yet the sources describe these monks fighting in full armor, wielding heavy-bladed weapons, and engaging in brutal combat. How do we reconcile the theology with the violence?
We have to completely discard our modern preconceptions of monastic life.
Okay.
In 12th century Japan, massive temple complexes like Midera or Enmyakuji on Mount Hai operated essentially as independent feudal states.
Like their own little countries.
Because of the shanshin system we discussed earlier, these temples controlled vast tax-exempt estates. They held immense wealth, they collected tolls on vital trade routes, and they wielded significant political leverage over the imperial court.
So they were enormous corporate entities with vast physical assets to protect.
Precisely. And to secure those assets, protect their borders, and enforce their will, they maintained large private armies. Right. The Sufi were not anomalous. They were a highly organized demographic. They were heavily armed, highly trained, and frequently involved in a vicious, localized territorial wars.
Often fighting against rival Buddhist sects.
Right. Exactly. When Prince Mochihito arrives seeking sanctuary, the monks of Midera are deeply experienced combatants, highly capable of engaging Taira samurai.
And that capability is put to the test almost immediately at the Battle of Uji on June 20, 1180.
The first battle of the war.
This is where the first real blood of the Genpei War is drawn. Let's look at the mechanics of this battle, because it is heavily defined by the physical environment.
Yes, the river.
Mochihito, Yorimasa, and their contingent of warrior monks are retreating, desperately trying to reach the broader safety of Nara. Their path forces them to cross the Uji River, which lies just south of Kyoto.
And the Taira forces are pursuing them relentlessly. To halt the advance, the monks make a severe tactical decision.
They destroy the bridge.
Well, they tear up the wooden planks of the Great Bridge spanning the Uji River, leaving only the bare structural beams stretching across the rushing water.
The visual details recorded in the primary sources are staggering. You have the massive Taira army massing on the northern bank, unleashing clouds of arrows across the river.
Right.
And on the southern bank, the monks are defending this stripped-down skeletal bridge.
And the literary epic The Tale of the Hike focuses heavily on individual martial exploits during this standoff.
Give us an example.
There is the legendary account of a monk named Gochi in Notojima who earned the moniker the Arrow Cutter.
The arrow cutter.
According to the text, he advanced onto the exposed structural beams of the bridge, wielding a naginata, a polearm with a long, curved blade.
Right.
And he used it to systematically deflect and slice the incoming Taira arrows out of the air.
That is insane. I mean, it requires immense physical dexterity and sheer psychological nerve to stand on a narrow beam above a rushing river while under volley fire.
It does. And the sources also detail the endurance of another monk, Tsutsui Jomyu Meishu.
What did he do?
The records state that Tsutsui fought ferociously at the vanguard. He engaged multiple Taira warriors, and by the end of his rotation at the front, his heavy armor had absorbed 60 arrows.
60 arrows?
Yes. Despite this, he continued fighting until physical exhaustion forced him to step back and allow fresh monks to take the line.
The ferocity is undeniable, but the mathematics of the battle simply do not favor the defenders. The Taira forces possess overwhelming numerical superiority.
They do. They eventually managed to ford the river, bypassing the bridge entirely and flanking the defensive lines.
The monks are pushed back. And the conclusion of this battle sets a dark, immensely significant precedent for Japanese martial culture.
Yorimasa's final act.
Minamoto no Yorimasa, the veteran warrior leading the prince's guard, recognizes that the defensive line has collapsed. He retreats inside the nearby Bujuan temple, and rather than submit to capture and execution, he commits ritual suicide. He performs seppuku.
The historical weight of Yorimasa's decision is profound. While there are earlier recorded instances of ritual suicide, Yorimasa's death at Bujuan is widely analyzed by historians as the moment that codified the aesthetic and procedure of samurai honor in defeat.
He didn't just rush into it.
No, he did not simply kill himself in a panic. He prepared a space, calmly composed a final poem, and took his own life with deliberate precision.
The poem he composed is a devastating reflection on his life. He wrote, "This forgotten tree never through the fleeting years burst into flower."
It is very powerful.
He is acknowledging his lifelong ambition to overthrow the Taira, an ambition that is dying with him before it could ever bear fruit.
It perfectly distills the aesthetic of the era, finding a tragic, profound beauty in the stoic acceptance of mortality and failure.
And what happens to the prince?
Shortly after Yorimasa's death, Prince Mochihito is intercepted by Taira cavalry and executed.
So, if you are looking solely at the immediate political ledger, the rebellion is an absolute failure. The prince is dead, the military commander is dead, the monks are scattered.
But the physical reality of the battlefield doesn't account for the political reality of Mochihito's edict.
Right. That imperial call to arms had already escaped the capital. It filters out into the provinces, moving eastward until it reaches the hands of a young exile who has spent 20 years waiting for a vulnerability in the Taira armor.
Minamoto no Yoritomo.
This brings us to the gathering storms of the early campaigns. Yoritomo is the boy who was spared by Kiyomori after the Heiji Rebellion in 1159.
The one he exiled.
Yes, he is now a grown man living in the remote Izu province. I want to dissect the mechanics of his rise to power. Because how does an isolated exile, closely monitored by local Taira allies, without personal wealth or a standing army, suddenly weaponize himself into a national threat?
The answer lies in his acute political intelligence and his ability to leverage social networks.
Okay.
During his long exile, Yoritomo did not languish. He carefully cultivated relationships with the local Eastern warrior clans. His most critical maneuver was marrying into the Fujo clan.
Ah, the Huja.
His wife, Huchi Masako, was a formidable political operator in her own right, and her family provided the initial vital military backing that Yoritomo required to act.
So he receives Mochihito's edict, he has the backing of his in-laws, and in the fall of 1180, he formally mobilizes.
He does.
But his initial foray is a complete tactical failure.
It was a disaster. In September, Yoritomo marches out, but he is intercepted at the Battle of Ishibashiyama. A Taira-aligned force catches his small army in a surprise night attack during a heavy rainstorm.
That is worst-case scenario.
Yoritomo's forces are entirely scattered. The historical chronicles describe him fleeing into the mountains, barely escaping with his life by hiding inside the hollow trunk of a massive fallen tree while Taira patrols searched the area.
Wow. He eventually escapes the region by boat, right?
Yes.
It is an incredibly close call. I mean, a near total collapse of the Minamoto resurgence before it even begins. But Yoritomo's response to this defeat reveals his administrative genius.
Instead of abandoning the cause, he regroups in the Kanto region. He actively distributes copies of Mochihito's edict, and he makes very specific contractual promises to the local lords.
Like what?
He guarantees land rights and elevated status in a new Minamoto regime if they commit their forces to him.
And that contractual approach works perfectly. He is offering disenfranchised warriors exactly what Kiyomori had denied them.
Economic security and political validation.
Right. And within a matter of months, Yoritomo transforms his scattered survivors into an organized army numbering in the tens of thousands.
It was an incredible turnaround.
This rapid mobilization leads to an event in November of 1180 that I find deeply fascinating, primarily because of the psychology involved.
Yeah.
The Battle of Fujikawa.
Yes.
A massive Taira force marches east to confront Yoritomo's new army. The two forces encamp on opposite sides of the Fuji River.
We have to analyze the condition of the Taira army at this moment, though.
Right, they were not doing well.
They have marched a long distance from the capital. Their supply lines are stretched thin, they are operating in hostile territory, and they are acutely aware that the Minamoto forces have grown substantially. The morale of the Taira soldiers is already heavily degraded.
The psychological tension in a medieval military camp at night must be immense. You have thousands of men sitting in the dark, anticipating a brutal, close-quarters battle at dawn.
And then the environment intervenes.
In the dead of night, a massive flock of waterfowl resting in the nearby marshes is disturbed, and thousands of birds suddenly take flight simultaneously.
The acoustic impact of thousands of heavy wings beating the water and the air is deafening.
I can imagine.
To the exhausted, highly anxious Taira troops, this sudden, thunderous roar in the darkness sounded exactly like a massive Minamoto cavalry force launching a surprise night attack.
So the panic is instantaneous and contagious.
The entire Taira army breaks discipline and flees into the night.
About a fight.
They abandon their camp, their supplies, and their weapons without a single sword being drawn by either side.
It is a catastrophic humiliation for the Taira command, and it effectively ceded absolute control of the eastern provinces to Yoritomo.
It really did.
So Yoritomo has a massive army, the Taira are retreating in disarray, and it seems like the Minamoto are poised to march directly on Kyoto.
But they don't.
Right. The war just stops. Everything grinds to an absolute halt. And the culprit isn't a brilliant tactical maneuver. It is an environmental disaster. From 1181 to 1182, Japan is subjected to the Yukwa famine.
It was a compounding catastrophe. The famine was not a singular event. It was the result of severe consecutive droughts, followed immediately by typhoons and massive flooding.
So the crops were just ruined.
The agricultural base of the entire country was devastated.
We need to understand the human toll here. The sources suggest that roughly 100,000 people died from starvation and the subsequent outbreak of disease.
It's a massive number.
And this mortality was heavily concentrated in the central and western regions of the country, which were the core power bases of the Taira clan.
This disaster forces us to confront the harsh logistical realities of 12th century warfare. It is easy to abstract military history into moving blocks on a map, but these armies were highly fragile biological machines.
They were entirely dependent on the immediate local agricultural output to function. Ask the logistical question, why couldn't they just ship food from unaffected regions?
They just didn't have the infrastructure for that.
Right. And if you look at the historical records detailing the Ioroi armor worn by elite samurai, you begin to understand the caloric requirements of just walking around.
Oh, absolutely.
This armor was a box-like structure made of hundreds of small iron and thick leather scales, intricately laced together with silk cords. It offered superb protection against arrows, but it weighed up to 30 kilograms.
That is roughly 65 pounds of dead weight hanging off a warrior's shoulders.
And you must factor in the primary weapon of the era, the yumi.
It's a longbow.
This was a massive, asymmetrical longbow, often over 2 meters in length, fired from horseback. Drawing that bow required immense upper body strength.
To field an army of 10 to 20,000 men, you are not just feeding the samurai. You are feeding their retainers, their foot soldiers, and crucially, thousands of horses.
And a horse requires a massive amount of forage every single day.
They lacked sophisticated, centralized supply chains. A medieval Japanese army fed itself by requisitioning or simply taking food from the local villages they marched through.
So if a drought and a typhoon have destroyed the crops, there is no food to requisition.
Exactly. The physical mechanism of making war literally ceased to exist. You cannot march a starving man carrying 30 kilograms of iron across mountainous terrain.
The famine dictated the terms of the conflict, forcing an uneasy 2-year stalemate.
It did.
And right in the middle of this catastrophic famine, the architect of Taira dominance is removed from the board. In February 1181, Taira no Kiyomori falls ill.
He contracted a severe fever. The legends recorded in the texts claim his body burned with such intense heat that when attendants poured water over him to cool him down, it instantly boiled and turned to steam.
That is a terrifying image. But he succumbs to the illness, leaving his son, Taira no Minamoto, to assume control of the clan.
And the historical consensus on Minamoto is quite harsh.
Because he lacks his father's ruthless strategic vision.
He inherits an absolute nightmare, a starving populace, a deeply fractured political base, and
This aggressive push forces the Taira to respond, leading to one of the most mechanically inventive engagements of the war in June 1183. The Battle of Kurakara.
The Taira recognize the threat Yoshinaka poses. They mobilize a massive army, estimated at roughly 40,000 men, and march north to intercept him at the Kurakara Pass.
This is a highly restrictive, narrow mountain route.
And Yoshinaka is severely outnumbered, so he relies on a profound psychological deception to break the Taira lines.
I want to break down how this tactic actually functioned on the ground, because it sounds like myth, but it leverages very real herd dynamics.
The oxen.
Yes, the oxen. Yoshinaka gathers a large herd of oxen from the surrounding countryside. He waits for night to fall. His men attach torches to the horns of the animals.
Right.
They ignite the torches and then drive this terrified, burning herd directly into the dense Taira encampment, immediately following the animals with a massive cavalry charge.
The psychological impact is the critical mechanism here. The Taira troops are encamped in a narrow mountain pass in the pitch black. Suddenly, they are engulfed by fire, the deafening screams of panicked animals, and the charge of enemy cavalry. The confusion completely shattered their command structure.
And the terrain exacerbates the panic. The Taira soldiers, trying to escape the fire and the hooves, are pushed backward in the dark. Thousands of them are forced off the steep cliffs bordering the pass.
The Taira northern defense isn't just defeated, it is physically obliterated.
This devastating rout leaves the road to Kyoto completely undefended. By August of 1183, Minamoto realizes that holding the capital is a logistical impossibility.
He makes the deeply consequential decision to abandon Kyoto entirely.
The Taira flee westward, retreating toward their ancestral strongholds along the inland sea.
But they do not leave empty-handed. In a desperate bid to maintain their political legitimacy, they take the young Emperor Antoku and they take the imperial regalia.
The sacred mirror, the jewel, and the sword.
This is a critical legal maneuver. In the framework of Japanese political legitimacy, whoever controls the physical person of the emperor and the sacred regalia constitutes the legitimate government.
So by taking Antoku, the Taira are signaling that they are not retreating rebels. They are a government in exile.
Exactly.
So the Taira flee, and Yoshinaka marches his army into Kyoto. He is initially hailed as a conquering hero, the man who liberated the capital.
But the victory quickly sours.
We have to look at the culture clash occurring here. Yoshinaka's troops are hardened mountain warriors who have just spent months fighting and starving.
They lack the rigid discipline required to occupy a highly refined aristocratic city. They view the capital as a conquered territory, not a liberated one.
Right.
They begin aggressively pillaging estates, harassing the citizenry, and disrupting the delicate social order.
So what does this all mean? The Minamoto are winning, but they are fighting each other.
Well, this behavior triggers a severe political crisis. The retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who remained in Kyoto, is appalled by the breakdown of order.
He realizes Yoshinaka is out of control.
He recognizes that Yoshinaka cannot be controlled, so he initiates a back-channel communication. He secretly sends word to Yoritomo in Kamakura, formally requesting that Yoritomo march on the capital to restore order and discipline his cousin.
This dynamic reveals a crucial reality about the Minamoto clan. We often speak of them as a unified faction, but they were deeply fragmented.
Very much so. They were a loose coalition of highly competitive provincial warlords who shared a distant bloodline.
Let's examine Yoritomo's strategic calculus here. The Taira are wounded, retreating to the west. This should be the moment to pursue them and end the war. Why does Yoritomo suddenly pivot and order the destruction of his own cousin?
Because Yoritomo understands that military victory is meaningless without centralized political authority.
Right.
Both he and Yoshinaka possess legitimate claims to the leadership of the Minamoto clan. If Yoritomo allows Yoshinaka to maintain control of the capital, control the retired emperor, and dictate policy, Yoritomo's own authority in the east becomes secondary.
It is the ultimate power struggle. Yoritomo recognizes that he must absolutely centralize command before he can finalize the war against the Taira.
He dispatches a powerful army from the east, commanded by his half-brothers, Minamoto no Noriyori, and a young man who is about to fundamentally alter the course of Japanese military history.
Minamoto no Yoshitsune.
Yoshitsune. Their orders are absolute.
In early 1184, at the Battle of Iwazu, Yoshitsune and Noriyori engage and destroy their cousin's forces.
Yoshinaka is killed, the internal purge is completed, and Yoritomo emerges as the undisputed, singular head of the Minamoto clan.
With the internal threat eliminated, the Minamoto can finally redirect their full military capacity back toward the Taira.
And this phase of the war is entirely defined by the tactical genius of Yoshitsune.
The Taira had spent the previous year rebuilding their strength in the western provinces, and they had adopted a very specific defensive doctrine.
The Taira recognized their numerical disadvantage in open field combat. Consequently, they relied heavily on static, fortified defenses that maximized the protective qualities of the local geography, backed by their absolute superiority in naval warfare.
Yoshitsune's brilliance lies in his refusal to engage those defenses on conventional terms. He treats the defensive geography not as an obstacle, but as a weapon to be turned against the enemy.
We see this vividly at the Battle of Ichinotani in March of 1184.
Ichinotani was a heavily fortified Taira encampment located on the coast. Geographically, it appeared impregnable.
To the south was the sea, where the Taira fleet lay at anchor, ready to provide support or an escape route. To the north, the fortress was protected by a ridge of incredibly steep, densely forested mountains.
Conventional military doctrine dictated a grueling, high-casualty frontal assault along the narrow coastal approach.
The Taira commanders knew this, and they heavily concentrated their defensive lines at the front gates.
But Yoshitsune understands the psychology of surprise. He splits his forces.
He sends a large, highly visible diversionary force to assault the front gates, ensuring the full attention of the Taira defenders is locked on the coastal road.
Meanwhile, Yoshitsune takes a small, elite unit of cavalry and initiates a grueling ascent through the mountains behind the fortress.
The logistics of moving armored cavalry through dense mountain forests in silence are incredibly demanding.
At dawn, Yoshitsune's unit reaches the crest of the ridge. They are looking directly down at the unarmored rear of the Taira encampment, but the cliff face is almost perfectly vertical.
The historical accounts note that even his most battle-hardened veterans hesitated.
I don't blame them.
The descent appeared entirely suicidal for men on horseback, but Yoshitsune supposedly observed a stag navigating the precipice and declared that if a deer could traverse the slope, a horse could do the same.
He personally leads the charge, plunging his horse down the near vertical cliff face. The physical momentum carries them directly into the rear of the Taira camp.
The shock value was absolute. The Taira defenders, heavily engaged at the front, suddenly found Minamoto cavalry rampaging through their command tents in the rear.
The defensive structure collapsed instantly.
The Taira warriors abandoned their positions, scrambling in sheer panic to reach their ships on the shore.
It is a devastating blow. The Taira lose several critical senior commanders in the chaos, and their perimeter is shattered.
But they survive by executing a naval retreat further west across the Seto Inland Sea.
A year later, in March of 1185, they establish a new fortified position at Yashima, an island situated just off the coast of Shikoku.
The Taira believed Yashima was entirely secure.
Why is that?
The Minamoto lacked a significant naval presence, and the Taira felt confident they could repel any amphibious assault long before it reached the shore.
And the environment seems to favor the Taira. As Yoshitsune is preparing his forces to cross the strait and assault Yashima, a severe, highly destructive storm hits the region.
The winds were so violent that the local sailors' men who had navigated those waters their entire lives flatly refused to launch the transport boats.
Several of Yoshitsune's senior commanders strongly advised delaying the operation until the weather cleared.
But Yoshitsune recognizes that the storm provides the ultimate operational cover.
He understands that the Taira commanders are looking at the same raging sea and concluding that an attack is physically impossible.
Right, so he orders the boats launched into the teeth of the storm.
It was a massive operational risk. They suffered damaged vessels and lost equipment during the crossing.
But they successfully navigated the turbulent sea and landed on the Shikoku coast, several miles away from the main Yashima fortress.
Having achieved complete tactical surprise, Yoshitsune utilizes another layer of psychological deception:
the bonfires.
As his small force approaches the Yashima fortress from the landward side, he orders his men to light dozens of massive bonfires in the hills behind the Taira position.
The deception works perfectly. The Taira commanders observe a massive line of fire illuminating the hills in the darkness.
Given the impossible weather conditions, they deduce that a massive Minamoto land army has somehow outflanked them.
They never suspect that Yoshitsune has arrived with only a few hundred men.
The Taira succumb to panic once again. They abandon the Yashima fortress, scramble onto their ships, and flee into the inland sea.
Yoshitsune captures the stronghold without fighting a major protracted battle. He uses the environment and the enemy's own assumptions to completely dismantle their static defenses.
However, this relentless push westward has a definitive geographical limit.
It does. The Taira have been driven to the absolute western edge of Honshu.
They possess no more strongholds, no more fallback positions on land. They are living entirely on their ships in the narrow Shimonoseki Strait.
The final showdown must happen on the water.
This brings us to the climax of the conflict. The Battle of Dan-no-ura, fought on April 25, 1185. We need to clearly define the mechanics of medieval naval warfare in Japan, because it is drastically different from the age of sail and cannons.
Oh, very different. These were not towering galleons. The vessels were primarily shallow draft oared galleys.
So no broadside cannons.
No, the tactics were essentially an attempt to replicate land warfare on a floating platform. As the fleets closed distance, they would engage in massive, highly coordinated broadside archery duels.
And once the arrows were depleted or the ships drifted close enough, the crews would deploy grappling hooks, pulling the vessels tight against each other.
Which allowed the heavily armored samurai to board the enemy ships, engaging in brutal, close-quarters, hand-to-hand combat on decks that were rocking violently and slick with blood and seawater.
It sounds incredibly chaotic. On the morning of April 25th, the two fleets face off in the Shimonoseki Strait.
Right.
And initially, the tactical advantages all heavily favor the Taira.
The Taira were born to the coastal regions. Their crews were deeply experienced sailors.
But more importantly, the battle is governed by the tidal currents of the strait, which are notoriously powerful.
During the morning hours, the tide is rushing rapidly eastward. This current perfectly propels the Taira ships forward, giving them immense kinetic momentum, while the Minamoto ships are forced to row exhaustingly against the flow just to maintain their lines.
The Taira exploit this momentum aggressively. They hammer the Minamoto fleet with archery volleys and use the current to force boarding actions.
The Minamoto are taking heavy casualties and are being pushed back.
But then midday arrives, and here's where it gets really interesting. The entire political destiny of Japan for the next 700 years is decided by the gravitational pull of the moon.
The lunar cycle causes the tides to shift.
Yes.
The current in the narrow strait violently reverses direction.
The momentum flips entirely. Suddenly, the exhausted Minamoto crews find their ships surging forward on the newly reversed current, while the Taira ships are instantly stalled, fighting against the massive force of the water.
As the physical momentum of the battle shifts, the psychological momentum shatters.
A Shikoku warrior named Taguchi Shigeyoshi, who was commanding a significant squadron of ships for the Taira, analyzes the changing tide and realizes the battle is lost.
In the middle of the engagement, he defects. He orders his squadron to strike their colors and sail over to the Minamoto lines.
This defection is catastrophic for the Taira, not just because they lose ships, but because of the intelligence Taguchi brings with him.
In these chaotic naval battles, the command ships were deliberately disguised to protect the leadership from concentrated archery fire.
But Taguchi knows which one it is.
Taguchi informs Yoshitsune precisely which ship is carrying the 6-year-old Emperor Untoku and the Taira High Command.
Armed with this intelligence, Yoshitsune directs the entirety of his fleet's offensive capacity toward that single disguised flagship. The Minamoto forces swarm the vessel.
The Taira elite, surrounded and boarded, realize that there is no avenue of escape.
The realization sets in that their entire clan, their political legacy, and their families are about to be eradicated.
What follows is one of the most profoundly tragic and frequently analyzed scenes in all of Japanese history.
Adhering to the martial aesthetic established by Yorimasa years earlier, the Taira nobility refuse to endure the humiliation of capture. They choose mass suicide.
Kiyomori's widow, the grandmother of the young Emperor Untoku, takes the 6-year-old child in her arms. She physically secures the sacred sword of the imperial regalia to her waist.
The literary accounts record her speaking to the terrified little boy, telling him that there is a beautiful, peaceful capital waiting for them beneath the waves.
She then plunges off the deck into the rushing currents of the strait, drowning them both and pulling the sacred sword to the bottom of the ocean.
The remaining Taira commanders follow her lead. Taira no Tomomori, widely considered their most capable general, famously dons 2 heavy suits of armor and ties a heavy anchor to his back before throwing himself overboard, ensuring he sinks rapidly and cannot be retrieved.
The nominal head of the clan, Munamori, hesitates and is captured alive, though he is executed shortly thereafter.
The totality of this defeat is difficult to conceptualize. The Taira did not just lose a battle. They were physically and politically erased from the landscape.
The Minamoto have achieved absolute, uncontested military victory.
But history consistently demonstrates that in civil conflicts, the moment the unifying external enemy is destroyed, the internal fractures within the victorious coalition immediately rupture.
The war against the Taira is won, but the bloodshed within the Minamoto family is just beginning.
This brings us to the tragic fate of Yoshitsune. From a purely military perspective, Yoshitsune is the undisputed hero of the war. He won Ichinotani, he won Yashima, and he won Dan-no-ura.
He should be the most celebrated man in the country.
But back in Kamakura, his older half-brother Yoritomo is furious.
We have to analyze the political architecture Yoritomo is attempting to build. It revolves entirely around the concept of centralized control.
Following the destruction of the Taira, the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa in Kyoto looks at the political landscape and realizes he has merely swapped one military dictator for another.
He is deeply threatened by Yoritomo's immense consolidation of power in the East.
So the emperor deploys a highly sophisticated, classic divide-and-conquer political strategy. He targets the one man who has enough military prestige to rival Yoritomo.
Precisely. Go-Shirakawa aggressively courts Yoshitsune. He grants the young general highly prestigious court titles, most notably appointing him as Kibishi, which is a powerful position combining police and judicial authority in the capital.
And crucially, Yoshitsune accepts this imperial appointment without consulting Yoritomo or requesting his permission.
To a modern listener, getting a promotion and a fancy new title directly from the head of state sounds like an absolute win.
It does. But challenge yourself to view this from Yoritomo's cold, calculating perspective. Why is this specific title enough to warrant murdering the brother who just won the war for you?
Because it represents an existential threat to the new legal framework of the Kamakura government. Yoritomo is constructing a system based strictly on a pyramid of personal vassalage and land rights.
Right. Every warrior in his coalition must owe their primary absolute loyalty solely to Yoritomo.
The currency of the new government is loyalty in exchange for land. If Yoshitsune, who is technically Yoritomo's vassal and the most famous general in the nation, can bypass Yoritomo entirely and accept orders, authority, and status directly from the emperor, the entire system is compromised.
It sets a legal precedent that Yoritomo's vassals do not actually have to obey him if the emperor offers them a better deal.
It devalues the entire currency of the Kamakura system. Yoritomo cannot tolerate a rival power center, even if it is his own blood.
He formally brands his brother a rebel and issues orders for his immediate arrest.
Yoshitsune goes from being the national savior to a hunted fugitive practically overnight.
He flees Kyoto and spends years navigating the country in disguise, constantly evading Yoritomo's heavily armed patrols.
He eventually seeks sanctuary in the far north, in the Ushu region, relying on the protection of the powerful northern Fujiwara clan.
But Yoritomo's political leverage is relentless. He threatens to launch a massive military invasion of Shuge unless the local lords betray Yoshitsune.
And in 1189, under immense pressure, the local leadership capitulates. They mobilize their forces and surround Yoshitsune's compound at the Battle of Koromogawa.
This battle is the site of a final legendary stand that is deeply embedded in Japanese cultural memory. Yoshitsune realizes escape is impossible. He retreats into the inner chambers of the main house to perform seppuku.
Out front, holding the narrow gate against the attacking army, is his most loyal retainer, the giant warrior monk, Benkei.
The historical accounts and subsequent legends describe Benkei fighting off wave after wave of attackers single-handedly. His physical size and martial skill make him a terrifying opponent and a choke point.
The texts claim he is peppered with arrows, absorbing horrific damage, but he refuses to fall. He holds the gate for so long that the attackers eventually become terrified to approach him.
They hold their distance. It is only when a soldier finally rides up to engage him that they realize Benkei is completely unresponsive.
He had already died from his wounds, but rigor mortis and sheer physical balance kept his body standing upright, holding his ground.
This event is immortalized as the standing death of Benkei, buying Yoshitsune the time required to end his own life with honor.
Yoritomo demands his brother's head be transported to Kamakura in a container of sweet sake to preserve it, confirming the kill.
With his brilliant brother dead and all potential rivals utterly eliminated, Yoritomo has achieved a total monopoly on military power.
He is finally free to permanently reshape the legal and bureaucratic structure of Japan.
This brings us to a new world order, the Kamakura shogunate.
This is the definitive institutional legacy of the Genpei War. Having witnessed how the seductive, highly refined culture of Kyoto had compromised and ultimately destroyed the Taira, Yoritomo makes a brilliant administrative choice.
He refuses to relocate to the capital. He establishes his government in his military power base in Kamakura, geographically isolating his warriors from the influence of the aristocratic court.
He builds a parallel government. And in 1192, the emperor legally recognizes this reality by officially granting Yoritomo the title of Sei Taishigun, or shogun, the supreme military commander.
But the title itself is largely symbolic, isn't it?
It is. The true genius of Yoritomo's system lies in the bureaucratic framework he implements nationwide. He establishes a dual system of shugo and jito.
I really want to unpack the mechanics of this system. What did this structural shift mean for a local peasant or a regional lord?
It was a fundamental reorganization of authority. The shugo were military governors appointed over entire provinces. Their mandate was strictly martial to command the provincial warriors, suppress localized rebellions, and investigate major crimes like murder and treason.
And the G2?
The Jitu, on the other hand, were state stewards. They were placed directly on the local manors and shon. Their role was economic and administrative. They managed the land, settled local boundary disputes, and, most importantly, collected the taxes.
And the critical mechanism here is patronage. Yoritomo is not hiring local bureaucrats. He is appointing his own fiercely loyal vassals, the men who fought the Genpei War for him, to these positions.
Exactly. He completely bypasses the old aristocratic intermediaries in Kyoto. The flow of tax revenue and the enforcement of the law are now entirely controlled by his warriors.
This officially transitions Japan from a civilian, court-centered administration to a highly decentralized, feudal military dictatorship.
Right.
So if you are a citizen living in this new era, the emperor still exists in Kyoto, he still performs poetry and religious rituals, but does he have any actual mechanical power to affect your life?
Very little. The emperor was reduced to a purely symbolic figurehead, conferring legitimacy but wielding no practical authority.
Because Yoritomo had legally and methodically hijacked the country's tax collection, land management, and law enforcement systems.
The strict separation of symbolic authority in Kyoto and practical, violent authority in Kamakura defined the political architecture of Japanese history for nearly 700 years, persisting in various forms right up until the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s.
It is an incredibly durable, resilient system. And despite its violent origins, it actually produced significant economic stability, didn't it?
Yes, the long-term economic result was overwhelmingly positive for the agrarian base. The strict, localized administration of the Jito drastically reduced banditry.
That makes sense.
Secure trade routes allowed commerce to flourish, and the warrior class actively encouraged the expansion of agricultural irrigation projects to maximize their own tax revenues.
So this stability allowed the population to slowly recover from the devastating trauma and famine of the war years.
It did.
The political and legal legacy of the Genpei War shaped the physical reality of Japan, but the emotional and psychological legacy of the conflict fundamentally shaped its cultural soul. We have to examine the cultural echoes, specifically the massive impact of the Tale of the Hike.
The Tale of the Hike is arguably the great national epic of Japan, compiled and refined in the early 13th century. It did not originate as a written text. It was a vast oral tradition, memorized and sung by blind monks who traveled the country playing a lute-like instrument known as the biwa.
The fact that this history was transmitted as an oral performance by blind monks adds a deeply haunting layer to the narrative. And what is so compelling about this epic is its tone. It is not a celebratory, chest-thumping, victorious account of the Minamoto triumph.
It is profoundly, overwhelmingly sad.
The epic is anchored entirely by the Buddhist concept of muju, which translates to impermanence. The famous opening lines of the tale explicitly state, "The sound of the Jian-shuja bells echoes the impermanence of all things."
It is a vast poetic meditation on the harsh reality that all human glory, all political power, and all martial strength, no matter how absolute it appears, is ultimately fleeting.
The cultural irony is incredible. The Taira clan, the losers of the war, the people who were physically wiped off the map, are elevated to become the tragic, beautiful heroes of Japan's greatest literary achievement.
The literature served a very specific psychological function. It acted as a cultural coping mechanism for a population that had endured immense trauma.
Right.
The epic balanced the stark, brutal reality of the new samurai governance with a deep, collective sorrow for the defeated. It glorified the tragic, inevitable fall of the Taira, and it enshrined the brilliant, doomed fate of Yoshitsune.
And by elevating Yoshitsune as this pure, highly capable, tragic hero, a man who maintained his loyalty but was ultimately betrayed and crushed by a cold, calculating political machine. The culture embedded specific core values into the samurai identity.
The epic celebrates concepts of fierce battlefield courage, absolute loyalty to one's lord, and the stoic, aesthetically beautiful acceptance of inevitable death.
These literary ideals form the foundational roots of what would eventually be codified centuries later as Bushido, the strict moral way of the warrior.
The legacy of the Genpei War is so deeply embedded that it is still highly visible in modern Japanese culture.
Like the colors.
Yes. During the war, the Taira forces fought under solid red banners, and the Minamoto forces fought under solid white banners. Today, red and white remain the definitive national colors of Japan. You see them on the modern national flag. They're used to divide opposing teams in the traditional, highly ritualized banners of sumo wrestling, and they even dictate the team divisions in the massive annual New Year's Eve singing contests broadcast across the country.
The echoes of this 12th century conflict are literally everywhere, which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to consider. We spent significant time analyzing how Yoritomo ruthlessly purged his own family. He executed his uncles, his cousins, and he hunted down his brilliant brother Yoshitsune, all to ensure the absolute, unchallenged dominance of his specific, centralized Minamoto bloodline.
He was systematically attempting to build an unshakable, permanent dynasty.
But this ruthless, paranoid focus on absolute control completely blinded him to the structural threat closest to home. When Yoritomo died in 1199, the Minamoto clan did not inherit the earth.
His in-laws did.
His in-laws, the Uji clan, the very family of his wife, Masako, who had provided his initial military backing, quietly and methodically manipulated the bureaucracy Yoritomo had built. They maneuvered to take absolute control of the Kamakura shogunate, turning Yoritomo's own descendants into powerless, nominal puppet rulers before eventually eliminating the Minamoto leadership line entirely.
It perfectly validates the core warning of the tale of the hike, that all prosperous and powerful things must inevitably decline.
The Minamoto won the Genpei War. Yoritomo designed and built the legal machine. But in the end, they could not outrun their own impermanence. The structural inspector looking for the stress fracture that would eventually collapse the system wouldn't have found it on a battlefield. He would have found it right there in Yoritomo's own house. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.